So Deuteronomy has said, I've rescued you, I've made you my people. That's not something you need to earn. I've made you my people, you just need to trust me. Actually, you won't. Your hearts will go astray. And so God says, I'm not just going to give you this gracious covenant, I'm also going to give you a new heart. It's this idea that he's going to bring the people back geographically from exile, but also spiritually, he's going to bring their hearts back.
Hello, welcome to the Bible OverBrew. It's great to be with you. I'm Rachel Redeemed, and we have, of course, Matt Searles with us to help us get into the second half of Deuteronomy. I'm really stoked to be back. I'm stoked about this, partly because I was really daunted, and I'm excited. It's all good. We must ask first, Matt, do you have your brew?
Got my brew, got my cup of tea, got my Bible. Yeah, looking forward to getting to Deuteronomy. Have you got a cup of tea with you, Rachel?
I do. For anyone watching on video, I have no string coming out of mine because I've gone Rooibos, Redbush, Roy something.
Nice.
This morning, so still caffeine free, but still going with something to cling on to whilst we jump into scripture. We are jumping in to Deuteronomy chapters 17 to 34, with our key chapters today being 29 to 32. So hopefully folks have managed to make it to the BibleOverBrew.com to have a look at some of the questions and steers to help us through this section. It is the beginning of the episode. We've covered a lot of ground. This is our last little bit in the Pentateuch here, and I think we need the story so far.
We do, and particularly because in Deuteronomy, earlier we saw when people are to be asked what are the meaning of all these laws, Moses says, well, when your children ask you that, tell them the story. Tell them where we were, where we came from, and the laws make sense in the context of that story. So Deuteronomy particularly says the story so far is really important. Rachel, can I throw it back to you for your take? Give us some of the things you've been reading through these big chunks, Genesis to Deuteronomy so far. What are some of the things that have stuck out that you're clinging on to as major points so far?
Let's go. Let's have a go. And also, I know that you'll fill in any gaps, so we're off and running here. Right, we start in a garden. It is good, and we are humans and God in relationship. And then we get the Genesis 3. It all starts to go pretty wrong pretty quickly. Humans are cast out of the garden, ultimately for their good that they don't eat from the tree of life, after a run-in with a crafty serpent. We then have Noah, a second go at an Adam figure. Balas, in a garden vibe, he again messes up. So we need more than a second chance. We kind of need, a do-over isn't going to quite do this for us. We need some other help going on. We then follow our big characters of Abraham, and he does some good stuff, some bad stuff. Abraham, we get the other folks like Jacob and Joseph, and yes, shady characters doing shady things. A lot of things described but not prescribed. We follow from way back many centuries ago, not long after the Bible began, for those who are familiar with the Technicolor Dreamcoat, that amazing story of God using unusual circumstances and the testimony of Joseph saying God used it for good. We jump into 400 odd years in slavery in Egypt, and we see the big showdown of Pharaoh versus Yahweh. Hopefully it's obvious Yahweh wins, hands down, in a very dramatic fashion, and reveals more of his character as we go through of what it means to be saved by him, as in they couldn't do it themselves. They've been saved, they've been rescued up out of Egypt, and they then have a tabernacle and a lot of stuff that helps them get through how on earth they're going to live with this new regime of living with this good, kind, generous, compassionate, slow to anger God. And they have the symbolism of the going up into the presence of God, which only one person can do, Aaron, once a year. We understand a little bit more of the sacrifices that are somewhat bewildering or baffling, but ultimately are for the good of the people relating to a holy God. Somewhere along there, we were supposed to have the land, people, and blessing to Abraham, which we've then seen pop up throughout our journey And we've been keeping our eyes out for a serpent crusher, of
Yeah.
which has helped make sense of some of the long genealogies. But currently, we just have a Moses figure who
Mm.
is giving us, some Jesus vibes. So he was the one involved in the rescue out of Egypt, doing some good things, doing some bad things. It's not about whether they were good or bad, it's about whether it was the Lord saving them and doing
Mm.
stuff through broken humans as he continues to kind of draw us back into a relationship with him. What have I missed? What do we need to highlight?
That was a great summary. I'm going to listen back to that. That was fab. Um, yeah,
Well,
I
it's
mean
thanks to you. You've been steering me well,
that's
so cheers.
that's great, and probably helpful to then just say, okay, so let's check in with those three promises that you mentioned: people,
Mm.
land, blessing. We've also got other ones: serpent crusher. We've got be fruitful and multiply.
Oh,
But I think
yes.
people, land, blessing is a really helpful one to go. Okay, where have we got to on those three at this
Mm.
stage? People, well, it was just Abraham, but now it is a people. It's a
Mm.
people who've become God's people. This great multitude came up out of Egypt, and the book of Numbers had lots of numbers, um, and thousands of
And
them,
grumblers.
and grumblers, numbers and grumblers. But those sent that the census is in numbers. We kind of think, well, all these lists of people. But if we remember God's promises to make a massive people, even if some of the details aren't clear, okay, this is now a massive people. Land, Deuteronomy is just over the border. It's just as in Moses speaks to the people just across the Jordan River from the promised land.
Mm.
And so the land is sort of in touching distance. We said they can almost smell the olive groves
Mm.
just sort of wafting in the breeze across the Jordan. So they're just about to enter the land. So we're putting some pretty big ticks next to the promises. And it's really helpful. I hadn't quite thought of it this way, but actually there's a lot of blessing in Deuteronomy.
Mm.
Towards the end, we'll see blessings and curses.
Mm.
Actually, something of what Deuteronomy is doing is, okay, I've made you a people, I'm giving you a land, I want you to enjoy my blessings, says the Lord, but here's how.
Mm.
And I think that so often the big picture is going to help us understand the detail. Uh, like when your son asks you what's the meaning of these laws, tell him we were slaves in Egypt, but the Lord rescued us and brought us. Telling the story is going to help us understand some of the detail. And so part of what Deuteronomy is how to enjoy the blessing of the Lord by living his way. It's a retelling of the law that they got at Sinai, really. But I
Mm.
think for the land that they're about to enter, which I think is a helpful context, that blessing is really front and center, even as we get into some laws that are pretty perplexing at times
Mm.
because there's just a different culture so long ago.
Mm.
So yeah, love that as a summary.
Whew. We jump in then at chapter 17, and I really got stuck by this one because suddenly in 17 verse 14 to 20 we're talking about a king, and A, they don't have one, and B, from having skipped ahead, I suppose, if I'm allowed to say that, having read the Bible previously, I know that them having a king is not necessarily a good thing because they're supposed to have God as a king, and it kind of doesn't really go well for them with the whole king situation. And then here it's got the stuff about what it would be to have a good king, and I was just a bit puzzled by that.
Such a good spot. There've been moments through the story where kings have appeared, or the promise of a king has appeared. Abraham and Sarah are told that kings will come from your line.
Mm.
The blessings at the end of Genesis, there's blessings on all the different tribes, and the tribe of Judah is named as the one from whom kings will come.
Mm.
We think, well, again, we haven't had any real
Mm.
mention of kings, but
Mm.
all the blessings on the different tribes, and okay, and the kings are going to come from Judah. So,
Mm.
and that's the Lord saying it. We'll see other hints as we get, even before we actually get to the kings arriving, other hints that the Lord has always intended kingship. And so here you get this law about the king, Deuteronomy 17, verse 14 and onwards. I think these really give us a window into what's going to come later. The people ask for a king for wrong reasons. They say, give us a king like the other nations who can lead us out to battle. And Samuel will
Ah.
say, it's because you've rejected God that you want a king. So their
Ah.
reasons for wanting a king were wrong, but it was always God's plan
Ah.
to give a king. And I think that really helps make sense of the books of Samuel, actually.
Yeah.
And when we get there, there are a few
Mm.
other things in the books of Samuel, how the book starts and ends, that point to this was always God's way. God always planned to
Mm.
give a king. And partly, if we remember that the Bible is all God's plan A. There's no
Mm.
plan B here. The Bible is all God's plan A. Well, how does it end? It ends with Jesus, this new Adam figure. It began with began with Adam in a garden, having dominion, ruling. It ends with Jesus in a garden city, Eden perfected,
Mm.
ruling over his people as this good and gracious king over his people. And so kingship was always something that God intended. It was always going to be ultimately in Jesus. And so even though the people's motives were wrong in asking for a king, they wanted a king instead of God.
Wow.
Actually, here the king is to rule under God. And actually, this is one of those moments where it's really helpful you've flagged it up, because we could easily just read on and go, okay, yeah, whatever. But just pausing, there's some astonishing things. The king must be the one the Lord God chooses. The king can't acquire great numbers of horses.
Mm.
Um, can't take many wives. Mustn't accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. I mean, pretty much in the ancient world, if you said, what does a king do? It's those things. It's
Ah.
kind of basically build himself up over the
Mm.
people, lord it over the people by being rich and majestic
Oh.
and powerful and all these wives.
Mm.
This king, rather, is to write out the entire law of God, possibly the book of Deuteronomy.
Mm.
So the king was to write out all of Deuteronomy in
Wow.
his own hand.
Wow.
He's to read it all the days of his life. This is Deuteronomy 17, verse 19, so he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees. This is the astonishing bit, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites.
Hmm.
I mean, this is radical. Like,
Wow.
look at powerful rulers around the world who amass riches, set themselves up, sort of look down on those they rule.
Mm.
Actually, the king of Israel is to be one of the people, not to set himself up above the people, not to think himself better than the people, but actually to be we might say, slightly knowing that where we're going, a servant king. And so when
Mm.
Jesus in Mark 10
Oh.
says, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them and exercise authority, not so with
Mm.
you. Even the Son of Man himself came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. Actually, this kingship law in Deuteronomy 17 says, yeah, God is pro kingship. God is pro King
Mm.
Jesus, as it will ultimately be, over his people,
Mm.
to lead the people in obedience. But the sort of king is a king totally unlike all the other nations. This was a radical law. And actually, historians and others will tell us that humility as a virtue basically didn't exist really till Jesus.
Wow.
Actually,
Goodness.
we prize humility. That's
Mm.
largely because of Jesus. He
Mm.
revolutionized how we think of character and what we should aspire to in a Greco-Roman world or so many other
Mm.
ancient cultures. Humility, no, that's weakness. That's pitiful. So this was radical in its day, and I think beautifully points to Jesus, who really lived this. So many of the kings didn't live this. Even the best kings,
Mm.
Solomon, one of the best kings, but then
Mm.
amassed wives, amassed horses, amassed riches, and his heart was turned astray. But actually, there's a beautiful picture of what leadership should look like,
Mm.
fulfilled in Jesus. And actually, as Christians, Jesus says, and when you have leadership roles, you are to lead like this, not lording it over others, but serving them, not amassing things for yourself, but laying down. So it's one of those little kind of, yeah, gospel Jesus glimpses buried in the middle of all this. I think if we read it quickly, we could miss it. But actually,
Mm.
noticing, wait a minute, kingship, what is a really helpful thing and a beautiful picture of both of what's to come in Jesus, but also it'll be a standard by which we'll see so many of the later kings failing. And so actually this law is really important because we understand why what the kings did was wrong, because they were setting themselves up over the people rather than serving them.
Mm. That is so helpful. Thank you so much.
Mm.
I think I'm going to take us from a nice, clear, being able to see Jesus moment to just something that's quite troubling, I think. Again, there's lots of laws. there's lots of things we don't understand, and ultimately being able to see God's character has been helpful, particularly landing this book. What do we do with the bit where 21 verse 10 and on, there's a bit where it's like women not being treated very well, the marrying of kind of female captives and what happens with them? Like, what do we do with this?
It's hard, isn't it, when we read things and we think this isn't how women should be treated. This is not honourable, justifiable behaviour. Oh, a number of things to say. I think one of them, I think possibly mentioned before, is that the laws at this stage are more of a kind of a base level than the ultimate fulfillment of where they're getting to. In other words, it's not this isn't the final word on the subject, but it's sort of, things are moving towards what we will ultimately see in Jesus as he fully fulfills and interprets the Old Testament law. By the time we get to Jesus, it's abundantly clear. I mean, it's just remarkable. I've just been reading Luke's Gospel again, and just how consistently women are presented as the models of faith in contrast to men. His treatment of women was just so revolutionary back then, and even today, actually. And so we need to understand that this is part of an unfolding story. This is where a good study Bible can be helpful, and there are things we just struggle to wrap our heads around. The one I was looking at for this was suggesting, well, let's picture the context. This is to do with when you go to war against your enemies, the Lord delivers them into your hands, you take captives, and then you notice a beautiful woman and are attracted to her. It is just the tragedy of war that so often women suffer. Rape, taking of women, abusing women, treating them badly is a tragic reality of war. Was back then, it is still today in so many examples. And so I think the way to understand this is as a sort of a legislating for an already existent evil. When people took plunder, they would take women. Here it's going to be, well, if you're attracted to women, she needs to have a month to leave her old life. I think the shaving her head, trimming her nails, putting aside her clothing when she was captured. I think she needs to have a month to kind of leave her old family, a month in your house as your wife, and then, then you can come together. I admit I still wrestle with that, thinking, why, Lord, didn't we get sort of all the way in one go and just, you know what, just don't treat women that way at all. But in the context, it would have been revolutionary, because it was involving treating women so much better than what's happening all around. So I've still got questions. I'm sure those listening will still have questions. Why, I think I might have mentioned polygamy, multiple wives. Why didn't God outlaw that from the start? Why does it really get to the New Testament before that's fully made clear? It's interesting, the law about divorce is one point where Jesus refers to it. Jesus being questioned about divorce, the Pharisee says, can a man divorce his wife for any and every reason? He says, what does Moses say? And they said, well, let's give a certificate of divorce and send her away. And Jesus said, Moses gave you this law because of the hardness of your heart. In other words, that's not the ideal situation. The ideal situation is there is no divorce, that marriages are faithful and people stay committed to one another. But it seems that God also legislates for, okay, I know that people are going to sin. And so he gives ways to try to minimize the impact of that. Here it seems to be a way to protect, so women couldn't just be taken and then discarded. Okay, if you see a woman, well, if you want to marry her and you're committed to doing that really and properly, then okay. To see where these laws are in the big picture, that this isn't the final word on the matter. Yeah, I think partly it's being in such a different culture. I just really, this seems so alien to what we know about how women should be treated. But I think back then, to see how revolutionary it would have been. As I've been reflecting, I think one thing I've thought of is just actually what's striking is how God's people should have been strikingly different in terms of how they cared for those who are considered the lowest, captured women.
Mm.
There are foreigners. They'd been captured. They would have been seen as the least. And so here there's provision made for them. We'll get this constant sort of trio in Deuteronomy: the
Mm.
foreigner, the orphan, the widow. Again, those who'd have been seen as least, those who are most vulnerable, they get
Mm.
consistent care. So I think, though we may see it as a kind of, we can treat women less well maybe than our society today would, back then it would have been revolutionary in terms of wanting to give more protection. Even as I still have questions and think, but Lord, yeah, I don't understand why it took that long and why these things
Mm.
were allowed and permitted seemingly for some time. That's where we interpret the harder parts of Scripture in terms of the easier and the clearer. And
Mm.
I just think Jesus' treatment of women is just beautiful and
Mm.
astonishing then, astonishing now. To be
Mm.
honest, we're probably only having this conversation because of Jesus.
Wow.
As in, if Jesus hadn't treated the women the way he did, I don't think, and I say I don't think, reading people like Rebecca McLaughlin, who's done good work on this, just seeing
Mm.
actually how so much of what we treat as kind of secular Western rights,
Yeah.
so much of it comes from Jesus and how he treated those who would have been seen as less in his society. It doesn't
Yeah.
remove the difficulty. There will be hard things we wrestle with, but just to ask the question shows that we believe Genesis 1 and 2. Male and
Mm.
female, he created them in God's image,
Mm.
equal. And therefore, when we see anything that puts women as less, then actually as Christians we can say it's not just our culture that doesn't like this. It's
Mm.
not just since the Me Too movement that women need to be treated right. Actually, in any culture, at any time, in any part of the world, because of who God is and how he's created humanity, regardless of what that culture thinks, it is wrong to oppress women in any way. That's not just
Mm.
me, a white Westerner, saying that, saying my
Mm.
culture's better. It's
Mm.
saying, no, this is how God has created the world. So actually,
Mm.
amazingly, there
Yeah.
is greater sort of foundation for some of these, what we would call human rights, because of
Mm.
how God's made the world.
Mm.
Having said that, I still got to this bit as I read Deuteronomy. I reread it this morning, and I still get there thinking, oh gosh, I don't like reading this. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that gives something of a help.
It does. It really does. And I found it was helpful, even just a few chapters on, we get to something I'd never seen. But just before we get there, I mean, even before we get to the end of that chapter, we get Jesus vibes of a man being hanged on a tree or a pole or being kind of put up there is cursed. And so you're thinking, okay, gonna log that one for later. I know we see it later in the Old Testament as well, but kind of pointing towards Jesus. But we get through some other kind of various laws that are a little bit easier to interpret. Maybe, if you see your mate's ox or donkey's fallen over, go and give him a hand. That's kind of commanded. You shall help him up with
Yeah,
it. And that's loving one's neighbor. That's saying it's not just all about you and your priorities.
yeah,
Or, the same one for, building a parapet or like a barrier around the top of your house so someone can't just fall off. Like actually health and safety is, it's caring for others, to think about how you build your property, what you do as a human has an impact and interactions with others, that you should be thinking of how can you love others through this. Or even the stewardship of creation, through not taking the mother and the young when you're looking for food, and kind of making sure that you're looking after your animals by not having the ox and the donkey plow together so it's not uneven. Again, I don't fully understand all that's going on, but there's enough there that I'm like, cool, the stuff that I don't understand, but I can see the vein that this is helping us love God and
mm,
love others. But the bit that properly blew my mind, it was a little grid that you'd pointed us to, BibleOverBrew.com, charting the 10 Commandments against the text in Deuteronomy. And I'd never seen this before.
mm,
And it kind of, it's a rough follow through. It doesn't exact, there's bits of overlap here and there, but being able to see that the laws here are kind of an exposition of what
mm,
the commandment says. It's kind of a building on that, and it's a
mm,
colouring in. And that was just really helpful for me when I'm there just kind of being a bit baffled and overwhelmed by all these laws, to then be like, oh, so these couple of chapters, yeah, like 12 to 13, it's about like where they're meeting together, and false gods. So it's about don't have any other idols. Or maybe it's the Sabbath. It's going to talk about the festivals and what's going to be their role in that time in chapters 14. Um, or even kind of looking at, murder is a bit clearer, 19 to 22, or adultery 22 to 23. That really, really helped me have a bit of humility. It's easy to kind of come in like, well, I don't understand this. This is terrible. Well, what's God doing here? But actually to be like, apart from, the continual provision for the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner, to actually even see that, oh, this is to help colour in the Ten Commandments that they've already been given in a way to live with a holy God, that this is how it's going to work out. I just found really helpful.
Again, it's that big picture. I think you mentioned just at the start of that, this biggest picture, this is all about loving God and loving neighbour. And I think that okay, yeah, the parapet on the roof, that's loving neighbour. Getting a little bit more specific, it's to do with care of life, it's to do with preserving marriage, it's to do with telling the truth. Yeah, as you said, I think that expositions into that context of the land is a helpful window, again, just so we don't get lost in the details and go, okay, we're not necessarily going to do all these things in the same way, but it's basically saying all these, the Ten Commandments, they're to be worked out in all areas of life, in all areas of our life. I haven't got a parapet on my roof. I think today that would be quite grand. Maybe one day I'll live in a house with a turret and a parapet and all the rest of it. But that was a thing for their context. But the point of, can we make sure that our houses are hospitable places where people are safe and welcome, not dangerous places. That does apply. And so I think, that big picture is really, really helpful. More we could talk on the laws, but I guess we need to move to the end of Deuteronomy, because we move out the section on laws to blessings and curses, covenant renewal, last words of Moses, sort of 27, 28, 29, I guess all the way through to the end. Did you have reflections on this section and how it feels and what was going on?
Yeah, I think it made more sense in the context of what we've been through, that it is there's a way to go, but also a warning that if you're not going that way, there's consequences. You're in a relationship. If you act one way or another in a relationship, that has consequences. Deuteronomy 29, verse 27 and 28 says, "Therefore the Lord's anger burned against this land, so that he brought on it all the curses written in this book. In furious anger and in great wrath, the Lord uprooted them from their land and thrust them into another land, as it is now."
This is what people will say when these curses have happened. This is looking forward to actually the reality that even though Deuteronomy has set out, here's how to live in the land, here's how to enjoy the Lord's blessing, the people actually won't do that. They will one day be cast out of the land, and people will say, yeah, the Lord's anger burned against them. They were cast out. So, I mean, it's astonishing that just at the border, just looking over the river into the land, and already Moses is saying, you're not gonna be there forever. You will be cast out due to sin. And I guess it's this tension we've just kept on seeing throughout. It was human sin that led to Adam and Eve being cast out of the garden. Sort of a do-over with Noah, bit of another Adam figure, but again, sin was a problem. Now the people are coming into a new land, a new Eden, really. But what we'll see is the people will sin in the land. They'll be cast out to the east, just as Adam and Eve were cast out to the east of Eden. I mean, it's amazing that as we embark on Joshua, Judges, the beginning of these history books, we know how the history is going to end. Moses told us at the end of Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
But there is just sort of slightly buried, we might say, there are these glimmers of hope. Just after that, chapter 30, verse 1, when all these blessings and curses I've set before you come on them, and you take them to heart wherever the Lord your God disperse you among the nations. When you and your children return to the Lord your God, obey him with all your heart, with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes, have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you.
Wow.
So not only as they're on the border of the land is the exile from the land prophesied, but so is the return. So is the return from what we know was Babylon, they went into exile, they returned from Babylon. The Lord will scatter the people for sin, but will bring them back.
Mm.
And there's this little phrase, when you take them to heart, when you
Mm.
obey him with all your heart. And like, well, but that's been the problem. The people haven't. They naturally have rebellious
Mm.
hearts.
Mm.
But actually, verse 6 of chapter 30, the Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, so that you may love him with all your heart and with all your soul and live. So Deuteronomy has said, I've redeemed you, I've rescued you, I've made you my people. That's not something you need to earn. I've made you my people. You just need to trust me. Actually, you won't. Your hearts will go astray.
Mm.
And so God says, "Not, I've given you this gracious covenant. More than that, this is, I think, probably the first hint of it. More than that, I'm not just going to give you this gracious covenant. I'm also going to give you a new heart." It's this
Mm.
idea that he's going to bring the people back geographically from exile, but also spiritually, he's going to bring their hearts back.
Mm.
And so this is where we start to see a little melody that will just be played increasingly in a greater volume through the rest of the Old Testament. But the Lord will transform the people's hearts. He'll turn their hearts back to him so that they can exhibit the faith they need to enjoy his blessing. And so at the end of Deuteronomy, we sort of get a negative ending, exile's coming, but we get the positive. The Lord will transform your hearts. And again, it's in Christ. It's as the Lord's grace is so supremely known, that's what does a work in our hearts. It's his grace that transforms us so that we can live for him. So we're not in the same position as the people of Deuteronomy, because they were looking forward to one day having a transformed heart, one day having God's Spirit within them. This will be developed through the Old Testament and fulfilled in Jesus. So we sort of get a positive and negative at the end of Deuteronomy. Negative in the short term, but actually couched within that are these positives. That's the thing. It could just be the same pattern. Okay, God will bring them back, put them in the land again, but their hearts are still sinful. They'll be cast out again. God needs to do something to break the cycle. And that new heart is what we see is going to do that. Lots more we could say about Deuteronomy, but as we conclude the Pentateuch, it'd be interesting here, Rachel, what are some of your big things you've taken away? Reading big chunks, not getting all the detail, but reading five books in a relatively short period of time. What are some of the things you've taken away from Genesis to Deuteronomy?
It's been better than I dared believe, and I came in daunted. I came in, and I've even done a bit of big reading chunks before, and so I was already kind of at an advantage, and I was still like, eek! I kind of think it's going to be good, but here we go. And to see the Lord's kindness and his generosity, and being able to keep the main things, and being able to see, even when we get troubling passages, to see them in the bigger context of a God who's being so merciful and generous to his people, who really wants relationship with them, and is he's going so out of his way to make good be possible for these rapscallion bunch of people. It's been really special to see and get to know God's character more, and to start to unpick some of the lies that I would naturally lean into believing about him, and to really see how cool some of these Old Testament passages have been. I feel like I can't believe I'm saying that when we've just been through Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but like it's true. Actually, having done it in a bigger chunk has just stopped that overwhelm of what's going on in each chapter. So I've been really, really grateful for that. Again, what a privilege to get to know our loving Heavenly Father more. There's been hard bits, there's been good bits, but considering, we've charged through the Pentateuch, I am humbled and enthused, and it's lovely to have so much more scripture in my heart and mind through doing this. What about for you?
I mean, Deuteronomy in particular, I think there's a kind of black and whiteness to it, or the contrast is turned up. God is holy, and there are some sobering passages that God isn't to be trifled with. Just in chapter 29, a verse didn't refer to at the time, but there's a caution against saying, 29 verse 19, I will be safe even though I persist in going my own way. That's just such a helpful verse. no, don't presume on this God. This isn't a God we can trifle with. It's not a God we can say, Lord, you said this. I want to choose to do something totally different and think I'll be
Mm,
okay. God is holy. God is a consuming fire. And so I think I've had my view of God expanded in that sense,
mm,
as well as, I guess, your point, seeing God's utter determination to bless his people. And so when
mm,
his people are even really badly and failingly seeking to trust him, he's just so gracious. So
mm,
if we're stubborn and just say no to God, realizing that's a really serious place to be. So there's a sobering aspect. But
mm,
actually, to those who come to God, God is so much more approachable, compassionate, desiring that relationship. Probably the world, outside maybe needs to get a bigger view of God and His holiness. Perhaps
mm.
Christians also need to be reminded of His amazing grace and patience.
Yeah.
So yeah, my view of God's been expanded in both those ways.
I'm piggybacking on that one too. Definitely, definitely for me. We are out of the Pentateuch and into Joshua up next for the next episode. So if folks are game to plug in or flip open or swipe to get through the whole book of Joshua, that's what we're going to be doing next time. With the key chapters being 1 to 4 and 23 to 24. TheBibleOverBrew.com will have your questions and steers those numbers again. If you can find the show notes, that will help you as well. And it has been a privilege to be able to make this. Thank you to Good News Broadcasting Association who've made this recording possible. And until next time, take care. See you soon. God bless. Goodbye.
Bye.